Passwords are critical gateways to your company's databases and networks, and potential open doors for hackers who want your sensitive data. The Start with Security video series and the resources at business.ftc.gov offer tips for creating comprehensive password policies to protect your business. Many of these tactics are simple, inexpensive, and readily available. Take password storage, for example. Encrypting the password data of your employees and customers is a valuable ounce of prevention. In one FTC case, a company stored its network user credentials in clear, readable text. A hacker breached their system and used this information to access customer credit card data. Two-factor authentication is another practice you can use to protect data. This requires employees to combine something they know, like a password, with something they have, like a code texted to their phone or generated by a hardware token, in order to access sensitive data. It's also important to protect your network against brute force attacks that rapidly try different character combinations to crack a password. In several FTC cases, companies failed to suspend or disable user credentials after a certain number of unsuccessful login attempts. Your password policy should limit the number of times anyone can attempt to log in. Also, require employees to use strong passwords in the first place. When it comes to passwords, longer is stronger, and require employees to use numbers, symbols, and a mix of upper and lowercase letters.
For more useful tips about strong password policies and building a culture of data security in your business, visit ftc.gov/startwithsecurity.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for the Start with Security conference and for staying all the way to panel 4. We are so glad to see you and to have everyone have so much support from the Austin tech community. My name is Katherine McCarron. I'm an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Federal Trade Commission, and I will be moderating a panel of experts on beyond bugs, forward-looking security features. I would like to introduce my very talented and esteemed panel. To my left, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is the Vice President of WhiteHat Labs at WhiteHat Security. Previously, he was the Chief Executive of Sec Theory and Falling Rock Networks. Robert began his career in banner click fraud detection at ValueClick. He has worked for cable and wireless doing managed security services, and he will share some of his war stories from his time at eBay as a senior global product manager of trust and safety. He literally wrote the book on cross-site scripting, so he has some excellent views on content security policies, which he'll share with you today. And he also originated the cross-site scripting cheat sheet for OWASP. To his left, we have Clare Nelson. Clare is the CEO of ClearMark Consulting, where she specializes in multi-factor authentication. She has more than 30 years of experience in high tech. Her background includes working on encrypted TCP IP variants for NSA, and she also has a focus on mobile security. She has published journal articles on multi-factor authentication, and in a recent assessment of more than 200 multi-factor authentication vendors, she uncovered a number of suboptimal technology choices, which I would like to hear about today. To her left, we have Caleb Queern. He's a manager at KPMG Cyber. He is a web application security researcher and board member of the San Diego OWASP chapter. For just under a decade, Caleb worked in cyber intelligence at Cyvalence, where he served as the company's chief scientist. He recently joined KPMG's cyber practice to assist organizations in applying appropriate information security measures to provide ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their most sensitive data. So to level set where we are, you're working at a startup, you have established a culture of security with our panel 1, you've scaled that security, and you are building it into the way that you do your development process. You've engaged in threat modeling, and you've identified what some of your most serious risks are to the security of your app or the entire stack. So we're going to focus on 3 main security features today that you could use, that you could implement at your company or with your products. And the 3 that we're going to talk about today are content security policy, multi-factor authentication, and site-wide encryption. I'd like to start with with site-wide encryption, and I'd like to start with Caleb to introduce this topic for us and tell us what is site-wide encryption and and define it for the group, and also what are some of the pros and cons of thinking about how it might affect your products.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. Site-wide encryption, or TLS, or SSL, depending on when you came about in the internet era. These days we like to call it TLS for transport layer security, and that's nerd talk for the little lock in the upper left of your browser that hopefully is there when it says HTTPS. That's what site-wide encryption is, and hopefully it is site-wide, meaning not just on the login page of your site, but top to bottom on every page and every interaction between your browser as the end user and the server on the startup's website in this case.
And what does it protect against?
Perfect. So what that essentially does is it simply means that the communication between you as a user and the startup's website or application is encrypted, coming front and back. So there's no clear text, meaning somebody in the middle who might be able to read the communication between the two of you would be able to understand what's going on, because often we want to keep those communications private and minimize the likelihood that anybody is able, when intercepting that communication, to manipulate it along the way. So those are the two things we want to watch out for, is that somebody else can read it or possibly manipulate the communication between the user and the application.
Okay. And Robert, I'm going to ask you to jump in a minute, but Caleb, can you let us know what some of the performance impacts are of site-wide encryption?
Sure. Thank you so much for asking. So for it's almost like she knew.
Funny you mentioned that.
To ask. So there's once upon a time, it was a legitimate concern among operations people and even marketing people that TLS, that little lock in the upper left of the website, slowed down the interaction and had a performance impact on the user experience, right? Which nobody wants. Nobody wants the site to load slower because, as we heard earlier today, for every half a second or so, or whatever the increment is of time more that it takes to load the page, you lose money or interactions or whatever conversions you're looking for on your website. So nobody wanted a slower website. And so there was a perception in the past that going SSL or TLS by default made a poor user experience. And there was a really great blog post by Adam Langley at Google, I think in 2012 or so. It could have been earlier than that, but he said, newsflash, TLS is no longer computationally expensive, which is, again, as nerds talk for, it's cool. Like, it doesn't impact performance anymore whatsoever. The default standard for everybody, because there's no reason not to do TLS anymore, is to go site-wide encryption by default. There's no performance impact. It is negligible, and even in austere environments, if, say, your new startup targets emerging markets where mobile connectivity makes the communication tough, right, to devices, it's still so minimal that it's not a good argument to not go encryption by default.
And Robert, I know that you have views about not only the performance impacts of it or the lack of performance impacts, but basically what the costs of having a full site encryption.
So when they say there's no performance impact, that is probably mostly true for most applications. There's some weird edge cases, like if you're on a super latent connection, because one missing packet in the middle of an SSL transmission could force you to renegotiate, do the whole thing all over again. So there are edge cases, so just be aware. That's why you'll see like airplane communications, for instance, are all plain text. That's for a reason. They want to make sure that they get there. That's why DNS, for instance, isn't encrypted. They want to make sure that you have the fastest path, that there's nothing weird in the way. They want it to be fast. They want it's okay if something breaks every once in a while, but the faster it gets there, the better. And so there are some performance stuff, but it's so minimal that most people would not notice. But I think there's a much more important point beyond the technical aspects of what SSL TLS are or what it could and couldn't do from a security perspective. It's definitely worth doing. But more so, it's better for your business, and I'll tell you why. Who here wants to rank higher in Google?
Yes.
Oh, really? Only half of you? The rest of you want to go down your sites? You want to get less traffic from Google. Is that true? Try again. One more time. Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. And the reason why I ask is they have said that if there's two sites, all things being equal, and one is using SSL TLS, they will rank it above the other site, right? So you're definitely going to want to do that. Now, that's the first half of that. The second half is when you eventually move from HTTP to HTTPS, there is a hit for SEO. It's around, depending on what you're talking about, 9% hit. Call it 10, just rough numbers, right? So let's say you did a bunch of link building over a year or something, and after that year, you switch to HTTPS. You have to do a redirect from HTTP to HTTPS. Every redirect is a 9% penalty, 10%, let's just call it. So it's effectively like you didn't show up to work for 35 days of the year. You know what I mean? It's like you just threw away a huge chunk of the value add. And if you really think about it, you'll never get it back either. It never gets better. It's always broken. You might be able to go and contact the people and say, please change your links, but that's the only way to fix it. And that we're talking about every link that's ever come in over that period of time. So the faster you switch, the less of the damage potential you get from having used HTTP in the past. Is everyone with me? Does that make sense? Okay.
So let's just say that you wanted to go home after this conference tonight and you wanted to implement site-wide encryption. How would an app developer do that? How would a company implement? Caleb?
If I may,
Yes.
I'd like to go back to Robert's point
Yes,
earlier, which was great.
Of course.
In addition to the penalty, if you are, all things being equal, ranking and 2 pages come up for the same results and you're HTTPS, you'll get the bump and you'll show up more often than their competitor. Great reason. Another is that sometime in 2016, Google has announced that they will begin showing a warning to sites that are not HTTPS by default, right? In that little lock and Chrome browsing and Android. So that is another reason that Google is pushing people to HTTPS by default. So another great reason, because we don't want that performance hit, and our marketing folks are going to be really upset at us if we don't do that. So the question was, how do we make the transition?
How would you implement it?
Okay, so traditionally, it involves doing a search for by SSL certificate, right? And there's tons of vendors out there. Usually, most of them are okay for the job, and they charge various prices for a TLS certificate. That's changing. There has been for a long time a organization that you can go to. Start SSL has always offered free TLS certificates, and you go there, you sign up, and they'll issue you one, and you have your operations folks install it on the website. So, however, the great news is there's a recent effort by Mozilla and another group of companies called let'sencrypt.org. So that's a good one to write down. Let'sencrypt.org is offering free TLS certificates as well, and a lot more easy management system. So it will be, the cost of going TLS by default is reduced. And it's going to be a lot more user-friendly because not only has the cost of going TLS in the past been a constraint to adoption, where you had to shell out anything from whatever it is, $5, $60, and pull out a credit card. There's a significant portion of the time people won't do that, right? Just because nobody wants to do that. It's going to be free and easily managed with let'sencrypt.org.
And once you have an SSL certificate, are you finished? Is it done, or is it an ongoing process of?
Yeah, just throw it in the trash. You're all done.
The certificate will
What
never
comes
expire.
What comes next?
So they expire traditionally on an annual basis. Depending on how you paid for them in the past, you could buy up to 3 years, I think, or maybe indefinite ones. There's longer periods. But I believe Let's Encrypt will be 1 year at a time. But again, that management panel that they're supposed to offer is going to supposedly make it a lot more easy to update that and keep things in vigor.
Right, and I'll add just one thing. It pays to shop around. Not all certificate authorities are alike. And I'll get back to a second thought. If you're a startup, you have to fall in love with one aspect of information security just to stay alive. And I would invite you that this topic, everything with HTTPS, SSL, TLS, fall in love with that. You'll have your own private soap opera. So in September, an unnamed company, well, maybe I'll name a name, Symantec, and they've acquired some certificate authority companies. Symantec fired some people because they issued a certificate and they made some errors with it. So what's the name of one of the largest .coms you can think of? Well, maybe it was Google.com. So they issued some certificates mistakenly for Google.com. And so the people that made this mistake are no longer with the company, but it's just a warning to shop around. The let'sencrypt.org, it's in beta now, and there'll be some testing, I'm sure, by some parties around to tell you how good that is, but it does pay to shop around.
One other quick point. On the performance thing, one shortcut that most people aren't aware of is there's something called the HTTPS preload. where you can tell the browsers companies saying, this is my certificate. Don't bother go looking it up. This is it. So it will automatically make a connection in an encrypted way to your website. There's some things you have to do on your website to enable it, so you'd have to find it and follow all the steps. But effectively, and it's hard to update, so you better get it right because it's in the browser. But once you have that there, you don't get that performance penalty of that first lookup. It just happens immediately.
And are there any other factors that a startup should consider when trying to decide whether to implement site-wide security?
I do believe there's another massive point to the conversation, which is HTTP 2 is on the way. We are currently in HTTP 1.1, and we've been on that forever. I don't know the original date, but forever. We're moving to HTTP 2 soonish. I mean, the actual server modules for the most common web servers out there, Apache, Nginx, and so on, already have plugins that you can adapt for your current implementation, right? So you can actually make your website HTTP 2 ready now. And HTTP 2 is the future. Everything sooner or later will be HTTP 2. I mean, people will argue the details of how soon and how fast, but it's the future, okay? And it is HTTPS by default. So sooner or later, you will need to. Why not start now? For all the other reasons we mentioned, it's going to be moot. So.
Yeah, and the nice thing about HTTP 2 is that you have less of a performance hit than you do with HTTP 1.1. Right. So it's actually better than what we currently have in terms of performance. So.
And are there examples of any websites that have recently rolled out site-wide encryption, and you've been able to use the website and it's seamless, or you don't even notice that it has the full site-wide encryption?
Sure, that's the great thing, is that you shouldn't notice anything when the website goes HTTPS by default. Wikipedia just went wholesale HTTPS. LinkedIn did a year or two ago as well. So yeah, it's happening on massive properties across the planet.
Great. So I'd like to move to the second security feature that we're going to talk about today, and we can come back if there's any additionals on site-wide encryption. But I'd like to talk about multi-factor authentication. And Clare Nelson is an expert on MFA, so I'd like to ask her to please lay the groundwork for us. What is multi-factor authentication, and tell us how can it best be used by companies?
Well, first of all, you know you're in trouble when you start to define what you're an expert in, and the definition itself is in question and being updated now. There is a classical definition of multi-factor authentication set forth by NIST in SB 800-63, and NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It's not my favorite organization, but I always have to quote it. And they say that multi-factor authentication is two or more of something you know, something you have, or something you are. And no fair picking two from or doubling up on one category. You have to pick from separate categories. Otherwise, instead of having multi-factor authentication, you have multi-step authentication, or just something else they call strong authentication, which really means nothing. So two or more of something you know, something you have, something you are, and those are factors. And things that are not factors are time, location, device ID. In fact, one of my favorite Austin startups, I'm looking for any people that belong to that startup, they depended heavily on location, which is not a factor, and they called themselves twofer. I called them onefer, but I had the last laugh because they were acquired by Salesforce in February.
So let's talk about the pros and cons of each of those. So something that you are, biometrics, your fingerprints, your retina. What are the pros of using something that you are as a factor in the multi-factor authentication, and what are the cons? Claire?
I'll go first, and
Okay, all right.
Okay.
No,
That's
go
my
right
favorite
ahead.
topic to talk, because
Okay.
I've already predicted and documented the upcoming biometric backlash. But how many of you ever reset your password? Yeah, a lot. How many of you know how to reset your
to something other
fingerprints?
than password, I hope?
Yeah, right, exactly. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. So how many of you can reset your fingerprints, your iris, your facial math? How can you reset that? So there's that issue. And then they're not secrets. The glass you touch, dandruff, your DNA, how many, you call up Schwab or Fidelity, and this voice may be recorded. Your voice is recorded all over. So those are not secrets.
And you take selfies all the time.
Selfie, yes, right. So
Admit it, I know.
and it surprised me that there are a lot of large financial service organizations, I won't name names on this one, but they're using selfies as part of their authentication mechanism. So in my eyes, it's a fad. Just like skirt lengths are high, medium, low, this is a fad, it too shall pass. But if you are using biometrics as one of the authentication factors, or it's something that's foisted upon you, just make sure that there are other factors or parameters backing it up. Do you want to add to that?
I agree with everything she just said.
Well, what about something? Well, what about something that you know? What if it's not just something you know, but it's something you've posted on Facebook and maybe other people know it too?
Yeah, one of my favorite banner ads was, it asks you all the questions related to doing identity theft. It's like, what's your credit card number? What's the date of expiration or whatever? And we'll tell you whether it's been compromised or not. And then the other one, it was a meme going around, and it asked you, like, what's your dog's name? What's your mother's maiden, or they'll phrase it in a different sort of way, but you're basically answering all your secret questions into this meme. So you're like, oh, and you send it to your friends, like, you fill it in too, and like. So things work really great unless everybody else knows it too. So.
Okay. So then we're left with something that you have.
Give Caleb a turn.
We're probably talking about tokens, right? Hard keys. Okay, so these are devices that are not in wide use. Maybe in the federal government, there's some applications where people have their cards and badges, but there are consumer-ready devices on the way. It would look like a USB token that you put in your computer, and that would serve as what you have to identify you, so that you can log into the website of choice.
Right, and more, you see someone's already waving. We have an answer in the audience, but more and more, your mobile device is something you have, and you can cryptographically bind your identity to that mobile device and use it as something you have. There are some issues with that too, but in the world of security, we all know that nothing is perfect, but it just happens to be very handy.
So nothing is perfect, but what does multi-factor authentication do? What does it help you with? So if you're threat modeling and you identify a risk, what is the risk that MFA helps address?
I think it really only addresses one thing, and it does a very good job of it, but it's brute force. If somebody already knows your password or is brute forcing you effectively, that is the one way it really helps. It doesn't help with phishing. It doesn't help with malware. In fact, when we were at eBay, which was the single largest deployment of second factor on Earth at the time, prior was AOL, we knew ahead of time that the way people understand second factor authentication, they feel safe. So as a trust indicator, it's a very high value. As an actual security benefit, it's sort of not that great because the phisher can ask the same questions. It's like, give me your token and I'll just replay it. So we would ask them, like, okay, knowing that it only solves this very small security problem that you probably don't have because you probably don't have weak passwords, hopefully, and you're not giving your password out, hopefully, are you still interested in using this? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. So it's a really useful trust indicator, and trust indicators are like the lock. The lock is something that you can look at, you can see the security, because typically security isn't something you can see. Now, the caveat here is we knew also ahead of time that every single person who used it was very much less likely to use the site ever again. Because second factor is very difficult for people to manage. They lose them, they break them, their kid presses the button too many times and gets it out of sync, or whatever. So it becomes extremely difficult. That's why phone is so great, because people typically do have their phone on them even when they're in the bathroom. They still have their phone. They have it everywhere, right? But it's guaranteed to reduce the amount of utilization of your site unless they need to use your site. So what we used at eBay for is not necessarily a security benefit, but we used it as punishment when people got phished too much or when something bad happened. If they couldn't manage to do their own security, we would give them this token, which naturally made them use the site less and therefore naturally were causing our customer support calls to go down.
So I have something to add to that in terms of the user experience, and it is punishment to use two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, because I go around using it for experimentation, and it is a royal pain. In the future, if they get it right, any of the 200 so vendors that are providing multi-factor authentication solutions, what some of them are trying to achieve is invisible challenge or frictionless user experience. There's one company called BioCatch out of Israel, and they have some problems. They insert JavaScript into your browser, which to me sounds like malware. They also have, it's a little creepy like Big Brother, but they collect, if fast forward 5 years, they'll get it right. So they collect about 500 parameters, behavioral biometrics, how you type, how you swipe, and even, let's say you're at your laptop and your cursor goes away. What do? You jiggle your mouse. Well, the way you jiggle your mouse is one of those attributes that they collect to identify you. So let's say you're about to buy something very expensive online and company XYZ wants to verify it is indeed you. Well, the invisible challenge goes, BioCatch magically makes your cursor disappear, you jiggle your mouse, and whoa, without your even knowing, they'll do other parameters too, but invisible to you, they have challenged you. They did step-up authentication without your even knowing it. Then, if you have a frictionless, invisible experience like that, maybe you're approaching something that will be at least not punishment.
And with the number of breaches that have been out there, people's usernames and passwords are floating around, given just the number of usernames and passwords that have been exfiltrated. We know that people recycle usernames and passwords. So just sticking with single-factor authentication doesn't seem like it's going to be feasible going forward, especially for really secure, really sensitive data. So
hold on.
Robert, what would you say about that?
So there's another cost too, which I think most people aren't aware of when they're thinking second factor authentication. Like I've talked with companies that you've mentioned that describe their implementation, and sometimes it's very seamless. It really is just putting JavaScript on a page or whatever, usually, because they usually have some back-end API hook or whatever. But the part that gets bad is when they have to physically mail you things. So now I've got to have a form. I got to somehow link that form to you. I have to have a buying flow, assuming there is something I have to purchase or whatever. I have to have fulfillment and shipping. I have to make sure it gets to you. Then I have to have the binding flow. Then let's say you want to get rid of it for some reason. I have to have the unbinding flow. I have to have the lost forgotten password flow, which, by the way, all of that stuff can get attacked. So it's not like your profile went down. Now you have like 20 different things you got to go think of. When we did the analysis, including all the error pages and everything, it was about exactly 100 pages of new actual flow. That is not, and it took about 6 people for about 6 months, whatever that works out to be, several years, of man time to implement at eBay, that's a lot, right? For very little net gain in terms of who is actually going to be using it. I mean, we didn't care about those users anyway. But we wanted off the platform entirely if possible. But the people who were going to use it were going to use it anyway. So people who their livelihood was based on eBay were going to use it no matter what. So they bought it, they wanted it because they knew that they had a problem and they were going to fix the problem because they didn't want to have the downtime and the outages, just like we didn't want them to have the downtime and outages. So I think where you see real value is like at banks, for instance, where it's not necessarily the authentication part that's interesting, it's the transaction. It's like, send me a text message and say, did you mean to send $150,000 to Romania? And you're like, no. We'll type in this code if you do. It's like, no, how do I not type in a code? That's a really actionable, useful thing as opposed to the typical way we think of second factor authentication.
I have a question for both of you to clarify, because we've been talking a lot about consumer-facing applications of two-factor authentication, but maybe to clarify for the audience, or at least for me, would your recommendations that it's sometimes not worth the effort be the same internally in an organization, say for your ops team with like critical applications?
Oh, I'll go first.
Sure.
When I do use cases, the internal employee use case is very distinct and different from the external customer use case. For internal employees, you can make him or her stand on his or her head, seeing all you need is love for authentication. That employee wants his or her paycheck.
Yep.
However, for the external customers, that's where you're looking for the seamless, the frictionless user experience. And a lot of large companies have tried to implement multi-factor authentication, and they failed because the customers rejected it. And you talk to any product manager, especially in retail, and if there's one more little step that will block a sale, they won't allow it.
Well, she's the expert, so listen to her.
So Robert, you were saying that, but if the transaction is what's important, if the amount of money or authenticating that you meant to transfer this data, that is when, for the customer, it becomes critically important before their bank account is drained.
Yeah, I've, in my career doing pen testing, have broken into the back ends of 2,100 banks now. So I've seen how banks work. The front end of a bank is usually not that interesting. It's just how much money you have. The back end, where you're actually transmitting money, the check images exist, all that stuff, the ACH transfer, all that stuff, that's where the actual danger lies. I mean, it's bad if you know how much money I have, but it's really bad if you can actually take it from me or do something like a negative transfer, like I send you negative $1, which means I take it out of your account, that kind of stuff. So I think that transaction part is the thing that we care about. We as a society, we care about that part. We don't care if someone sees our account probably as much. We still have some level of authentication there, but the really bad part is when they can take it from you.
So looking ahead 5 years into your crystal ball, when MFA is seamless and frictionless, what is it going to look like? How will the people who are writing code right now, how will they implement multi-factor authentication?
I'll go. One big difference is going to be it'll be a continuous process. Some of the distinctions made here is sometimes multi-factor authentication is just a gate at login, or maybe it's just step-up authentication if a high-risk activity is about to be executed. But in the future, it'll be a continuum. And it won't be just authentication. There'll be a lot of other things happening, risk analytics, maybe predictive analytics, but it'll be a continuum.
And there are 200 vendors out there. Some of them are suboptimal. The ones who are doing it well, do you recommend that someone build their own multi-factor authentication in-house, or that they look for it on the outside? I'm getting lots of this.
Just kidding. No, I don't do that.
What would you recommend?
I was just going to offer that among the many vendors out there, and I haven't tested this myself, but Google itself offers an API for two-factor authentication. Then you can leverage their already existing system as a kind of sideways opportunity to do it quicker, and now hopefully not spend as much getting it up and running.
And are there any open source multi-factor references that we could refer to the audience?
I have one to recommend. It's right here in Austin. It's gluu.org, and that's gluu.org.
Great. All right, thank you. So I'd like to turn to the third security feature of the afternoon. And so, Robert, I'd like to ask you to kick this off for us, please. This is content security policy. Would you level set for us and tell us what content security policy is and what sort of risks it can help startups address?
So once upon a time, Netscape had a failed security model where they said if you go to a site that is trustworthy, like eBay, which is where I came up with this, if you go to eBay, the site should downgrade its security into the least secure method or model or whatever so that you can render all the content on eBay because eBay is trustworthy. So I went to the Netscape guys and I'm like, this is ass backwards. Like, I wanted the opposite. I want it to be super, super secure when you get to eBay, not the other way around. Like, what are you doing? You're totally screwing me on this. And so they didn't get it at all. So I went to Mozilla and I said, how about this? How about if you trust me, let me tell you to not trust me. How about that, right? Let me, as a website, give you the indicators of things I do and don't want to allow. And they loved the idea. They thought it was great. So that became something called content restrictions, which is now called content security policy. And now it's in your browser. But basically what it is it prevents certain content from being rendered or certain things from happening on your website. Specifically, it was designed for us for cross-site scripting and certain types of overlays that eBay didn't like. So for instance, if I was able to put something up on top of a bid button and you clicked it and went to a different page other than our sign-in page, that would be bad. That's called phishing. If I can change my feedback score from 1 to 1,000, that's bad because it makes you think it's a trustworthy vendor or whatever. And so bad guys are doing this all the time. So is there a way that we could sort of limit what the browser can do? So that's the basic premise.
So you're whitelisting sites, in other words, rather than blacklisting?
Right, whitelisting sites and types of content you want to allow. So for instance, like I may want to allow JavaScript to be pulled in from eBay, from my own site, but I don't necessarily want to allow JavaScript to be pulled in from some other site, from some malicious website, as an example. Or I may want to allow inline JavaScript to be there, but I may not want it to be obfuscated. So remove things like eval. So eval and other things like set it, like timers and stuff, where it can obfuscated content can exist, because eBay is really good at reading content, but it's really bad if it's obfuscated. So sort of removing that from the equation.
So how can you make sure that your content security policy is working properly and it's not going to break your site?
Well, it will break your site. It absolutely will break your site. I don't want to have any illusions about this. It is one of the most draconian pieces of code ever existing. But the nice part about it is if you know that ahead of time, you can do a lot of testing and get it perfect. So if the time to implement it, very similar to HTTPS, is as soon as possible. Like day one, you launch a site, put it on there right then. Don't wait 6 years and then try to retrofit it on a legacy thing with 100,000 random HTML pages written by God knows whom, with God knows what widgets put on there. That will definitely break 100%. Guarantee, absolutely something will break. So if you're okay with some breakage, if you've got like 90% of it mapped out and 10% sort of legacy stuff that no one goes to anyway, maybe that's okay. There's plenty of ways to look at the site, crawlers. You can crawl the site, find all the embedded content. You can manually go through it, which would be a nightmare, but you could. There's a plugin called Request Policy in Firefox, which will break in exactly the same awful ways, typically, that content security policy will. Any cross-domain content. NoScript, very similar. It breaks JavaScript in very kind of awful ways. So those are sort of precursors. If your site works great with those two things, it'll work great with everything else, right? It'll work great with content security policy. But the cheapest way to test is just to put the report API. So you put this little thing in there that says, if I'm about to block rather than block, send a message to a server and tell me what would have been blocked. So you can sort of put it in this test mode, and you can leave it there for a month or whatever you feel like until you really get a good feel for what's going to get blocked, fix what needs to get fixed, or don't. If it's not that important, delete it or whatever through your one redirect, and you're off the races.
So Robert, now that I'm sitting next to the father of content security policy, did he really own up to that earlier? That was back in 2004, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that.
Prescient. So you can do this report-only mode, and you can see ahead of time what might be broken. Tell me, can you also see if there's some cross-site scripting attacks? From whence and how did they arrive?
Yes, thank you for asking.
That is wonderful. I was hoping he would say yes.
That's so funny you mentioned that. So that same report API, when you actually are using it, let's say you actually now it's actually out there being used or whatever, or not. Let's just say you're just kind of curious what's going on your site. You can use that report API to see where people are injecting. So the browser actually acts as the canary in the coal mine. It will actually, as some bad thing is happening to that user, unwittingly, that user will help you, inform you about the attack that they're currently under, which is cross-site scripting.
Thank you. Caleb?
Sure.
Thank you so much for asking, Claire. I really appreciate that.
We didn't even rehearse this.
Whenever I talk about content security policy, I like to liken it to the Incredible Hulk, right? It is pound for pound the strongest ally you could have on your team and will defend you against essentially, I know there's exceptions, right? But an entire class of OWASP top 10 attacks, right? Script injections and all that other nasty stuff, right? That, at the end of the day, in terms of return on investment, is incredible, right? To be able to go to your boss at the end of your year and say, I minimized the possibility that cross-site scripting is going to happen on our application is going to get you a raise. I mean, hopefully. I mean, it's going to be painful, right? I mean, that's why I also say it's the Incredible Hulk, because not only is it like the most powerful thing you could have on your team, but it's also very finicky and breaks stuff, right? Things can get broken. But the good news is
they do get broken.
Well,
actually.
they tend to as well. There's 2 points. One is, like you said earlier, like you don't want to try this at home when your application's been out there forever, right? But by default, if you're breaking out a new application, every time from now on, content security policy should be there. But when you do, to minimize the breakage even in that, you don't have to go full bore. You can just try one little policy that says, I'm just going to right now whitelist the places where images can come from or CSS files. But don't, of course, go rush out and put your entire policy out there because something bad's going to happen. But yes.
So pound for pound, it's the most powerful ally you can have. But as we talked about earlier, security has costs. So what does it cost to implement content security policy on your site? Let's just say that we're starting on day one. You're developing new software, so you're not retrofitting. But how much time does it take? What does it cost?
I want to hear Robert's answer on this one.
Well, I mean, in practice, it's just putting one specific header on your page. So you can do it either in the meta part of the content of the HTML of the page, or you can do it as an HTTP header. Putting an HTTP header, I mean, edit a file, which is htaccess or http conf, restart Apache if you need to, and you're done. That's how fast, I mean, in time to actually implement it. If you do it in a meta, it sucks because you got to do it in a lot of places, and it doesn't work for things like PDFs or other weird, like non-HTML content. But basically, a few seconds per file kind of thing. It's pretty fast. The hard part comes in knowing what you're going to put in the policy. So defining your policy up front is actually hard. That's kind of why I prefer the centralized location, doing it as a HTTP header as opposed to individual files, especially since eventually you might want to change that, and then you're going to have to go edit all those files again, which kind of sucks. Or if you absolutely have to, you can put it in the HTTP headers inside of like load balancers and crypto clusters and like front-end proxies, IDS, IPS, that kind of stuff. So they're submitting that content. But I think the real cost is the QA. I think that's by far the hard part. Going and finding every single page and making sure it doesn't break anything in the way you expect it not to break things, and actually break things, like test it, try to make it break. Like this should have been blocked, did it block? Testing your reporting function, making sure it's reporting properly. Like that's the hard part, the QA.
I was also going to add, I love that answer, that when you implement content security policy and you virtually, most days, most of the time, eliminate cross-site scripting. I know that's a dangerous statement, but most of the time that's what it does. You have signed 0 vendor contracts, right? You have had 0 pallets of hardware show up at your data center, right? But you can go to your boss at the end of the year and say, look at what we've done. Tell that to the CISO, and that's a win, right? At almost 0 cost. So massive return on investment for headers like that.
And now several big name companies have rolled out content security policy. Twitter, Yelp, GitHub, Facebook. What can we learn from some of the companies that have done this? Because these were not day one companies rolling out content security policy. They retrofitted it. I assume it was painful.
A/B testing. Just do it in subsets of your, 1 out of every 100 interactions. Just jam it in there and see how many errors you get back in your report URI, so that you don't kill the entire user experience for your entire set of users. That's my biggest advice.
I have one thing to add to that. There was an RSA talk, and I can't pronounce her name, so I wrote it down. The name is Ksenia Dmitriev of Cigital, and she's given an RSA talk, and she referenced the large rollouts, Twitter, Yelp, Facebook, and she said that they created tools or used some tools to help cull through all the reporting and all of the information that's collected as a result of doing this. So there's this pre-processing preparation up front, and then there's the post-processing afterwards. What do you do with all this knowledge you get from running it? And one of the companies said they were keeping all of their information proprietary, and they had a tool, and others were sharing it. Did you have something to add?
I was just going to add that a lot of times those reports that come back from the browsers when there's a content security policy violation, those can often be kind of noisy, and the signal-to-noise ratio can be kind of tough to swallow. So that's a little bit more of the cost of the work of filtering out all the noise, because weird things happen in browsers. But yeah.
Any lessons learned that you'd want to share, Robert?
This is actually closer to Claire's question earlier. One of the other values is that report functionality is sometimes really interesting beyond a user getting compromised. Sometimes the attacker will be testing and inadvertently trip up and send the report. Because a lot of attackers don't really know what they're doing. So every once in a while, the very first alert you see on some page that is vulnerable or whatever, and normally would get attacked and be successful, you'll see them testing, and you'll see them coming from whatever IP address with whatever user agent, all that stuff, and it can actually help you in forensics exercise as well. In terms of rollout, I mean, it really depends on the site, depends on what you've got. But I think we said all of the major stuff. It's just a big QA exercise is really the major cost.
One thing I'd like to ask your expertise on is what are some free resources that our audience here and online can take home with them some either OWASP or open source or trustworthy sites that you would recommend for content security policy to either to test CSP behavior on browsers or otherwise?
No? So there's csptester.io, which is pretty awesome. I personally really like using proxies like Burp Proxy, which is there's a free version of Burp Proxy, or Peros, or any one of those, Zap, which is a OWASP version, open source. Anything that allows you to see the HTTP headers and analyze what's going on, because sometimes what you typed in isn't what happened. Like you'll think you typed something in, like some people will cut and paste out a word and you'll end up with things that aren't quotes, and weird stuff will happen. So knowing exactly what you're submitting and knowing exactly what that content is super helpful. I think there's securityheaders.com, which will do effectively the same thing. I prefer the proxy version personally because I don't like anyone getting in between me and the content. I don't like anyone else parsing it or analyzing it and then handing me the analysis. I prefer seeing the raw data with like actual bits and bytes, which is one of the nice things about Burp, which is why I recommend it. No affiliation, I promise. But if you look at it, you can actually see the hexadecimal code of each thing, and a quote looks a lot different in hex than in something that's not a quote. So.
Full disclosure, I created securityheaders.com, and another confession is I'm not a designer. So when you go there, and you can tell whoever wrote that is not a designer. So, but there is an API, and you can automate your tests of your headers using securityheaders.com. So.
Okay, well, so in the last few minutes of this panel, first of all, I wanted to offer the panel itself an opportunity to say anything on any of these three topics that we haven't had a chance to say, and then I wanted to open it up for questions. But first, if there are any take-home points, Claire?
Yes, and we prepared. It may not sound like it, but we did prepare ahead of time, so I'm going to steal some of Robert's thunder, because you should write this down. SSL Labs with 2 L's, so SSLLABS.com. Go there. I put in ftc.gov just to make sure you guys were really doing it right, and you got an A. So, and it's not just
what that is,
yeah.
Claire.
Well, it's not
Like,
just
give
a
us some
letter
background.
grade, and I'll pass it back because Robert made sure that we would talk about this. But
go ahead.
there is everything you'll ever want to know about websites and how they work, how secure are they, SSL or TLS, what version, are they on 1.2, the certificate authority from whence that, everything you'll want to know, and this is a great learning experience because you should dive down, and it's just a magical mystery tour.
You can also use it on your competitors and vendors, and there's some really interesting stuff out there. It's neat to see what people are doing right and doing wrong, and you can use it as a buying tool as well. Like if you're about to like make a purchase with a vendor or something, you're like, I would have purchased with you, but it looks like you guys are terrible security. And it forces them to sort of go do what they need to do to protect you. And you're like, here, you hand them a report, and it's actionable. It actually has like advice, like here's what you should be doing, here's the headers you should be setting. It's really and it's free. That's the best part, right? It doesn't cost you anything. You just go there, you type in your website or a website, hit enter, and wait 5 minutes, and out comes your score.
I have 2 points on SSL Labs and their ability to test TLS implementation. So number one, we talked about ftc.gov. I want to give a huge shout out to Eric Mill of 18F, which is a federal agency downtown in DC. He's done superhero work in making the federal government's sites go HTTPS by default. Now, right now, due to Eric Mill's work, I believe there's actually in the preload list of sites that should be by default visited only by HTTPS. If you do a search for .gov sites around the entire planet, anybody want to know what the breakdown is of country by country?
Yes.
So, okay,
I want to know.
Somebody wants to know. So there's about 1 in Australia that is HTTPS by default with preload, HSTS headers. There's 3 in the UK, maybe 4, and there's about 32 now from the United States. And there's no other countries on the planet that do this. So the federal government is in good hands, and it's amazing work by Eric Mill. So if anybody gets back to DC, thank him for everybody. The other thing I wanted to say about SSL Labs from Ivan Ristic and the gang at Qualys is we talked a lot about the details and, shocker, the best practices of TLS implementations, and the certificates change regularly, right? So unfortunately, it's not one and done, like you get it set up and you can walk away. things change. SSL protocols and TLS implementations, there's holes. Right? People find problems with OpenSSL, and on and on and on. So you can automate. There's an API for SSL labs, right? So you can actually have your results sent to you. That's step one. Number two is it's an amazing communication tool for your superiors. I keep coming back to how to communicate security and success for wins, right? For you, right? Because we all want that raise at the end of the year, but also for your organization. So it's a simple letter grade like we grew up with. It's like an A for great, A+, and it's green. And then a C is red, or F is red. That's so easy to communicate to people who aren't technical but are probably paying you, right? So it's a big plus of using SSL labs.
That's great. Can we talk about Pulse? I think it's so
yes.
cool.
What about Pulse?
Pulse.cio.gov is actually one of the most interesting sites I've ever seen. So I have no idea why the government decided to do this, but I really love it. They took all of their sites and decided to give themselves a grade, which through using SSL Labs, and then put it on a website for you to go look at. So you can actually decide, if let's say you work for local government or whatever, why aren't we higher on this list? It's sort of a name and shame sort of thing. But you can sort and look just by Fs. I just want to see just the people who are bad and go see what their implementations look like. And you actually learn a lot about what actually doesn't work as well as what does work, if that makes sense. It's really cool.
And these kind of metrics that we are referring to, what are the benefits of having a scorecard or some sort of dashboard that you can show to your boss, or that you can...
You can sort by Fs and attack the ones on the F list? And
Caleb?
At the end of the day...
I was kidding about that, by the way. That wasn't clear.
At the end of the day, security doesn't generally make money for companies. It minimizes risk for companies. Okay, so we want to be able to communicate how we've done that and how fast. Right. A lot of times, in my presentations I usually ask the audience a simple question. I say, "What is our job as information security professionals?" And I'll get these great answers like, "Oh, I come in the morning, I tune the firewall, or I turn this knob and I push that button and I turn that lever." And I said, "Well, those are all great answers, but I think, would you agree with me that our job is to minimize risk?" And they start shaking their heads. And I say, "How about what if I told you our job is to minimize the most risk cheapest?" And they start saying, "Yeah, that sounds good." And then how about most risk cheapest fastest? And then they're all like, "Yes, that's our job. That's really what we're here for." And so when you can communicate and tie that mission of everybody in the security organization to metrics, right? And you can say, here's how the needle moved, right? We were a C, now we're an A. We were a 3 out of 10, now we're an 8 out of 10. That's powerful because that gets communicated up to his boss or her boss, right? And now you're at the board, and now people are happy.
So we only have a few minutes left.
I have one more thing to add,
yes,
though,
please,
about metrics. It's a little pet peeve of mine. I've written there's an ISSA journal article about security metrics, and the only thing that I'll caution about is, okay, so you're a startup CEO or a startup person here. What's the most important thing for you as a startup individual or any individual? How do you make decisions? And the only thing I'll caution is that with security metrics, be careful how you use them to make decisions. You can quantify, it's good to quantify your work and to measure it and to show progress, but if you're going to use it to make decisions, I'll just throw a word of caution. And how do you know if you're safer today than you were yesterday based on metrics? Just a word of caution.
And so this really just goes back to the threat modeling, and you need to figure out, what's important and what risks to take on first. So do we have any questions from the audience? I would love to use the last few minutes of our day asking our panel anything you've got on your mind, please.
So say you're a small, medium business and you want second factor authentication. How do you choose the second? How do you approach the project of selecting 2FA?
Well, one thing you can do is, since there are 200 vendors out there, if they give you a term sheet, you can cut that in half right away. You can go to any of the other 199 vendors. And if you're a small enough company, you can get free service. Duo Security, if you're 5 to 10 employees, you get free service. There's glue.org for open source, but you don't have to spend a lot of money to implement something as a startup.
I saw a question right here in the front.
So this could be a good follow-on then. So if you decide to roll your own, One thing not to do is allow white space and then strip it out when you save to the database, because it allows for the same answer for all the questions, and it lessens the effectiveness of it greatly. It's great for test automation, but it's not so good for the customers.
Yeah, that is also true with passwords, incidentally. People often cut and paste passwords, and they don't realize they're capturing the new line at the end or the white space at the end. And so a lot of companies will strip out white space because of that, because they're getting customer support calls. And customer support is costly as opposed to just letting someone log in when they have approximately the right password. But the problem is that can be a really weird experience when some of the system knows what their actual password is, like the front end, because it's coded that way, and some of the back end, like API type stuff that might go through a completely different system, doesn't have that sort of front end logic to take that out. So you do have to be careful with white space in general, good and bad. It increases entropy, but it also creates customer support.
Do we have any other questions for panel 4? In the back, please.
So I have a 2-year-old phone, and I'm trying to access ftc.gov, and I'm not able to access it on my phone. So I think that's because of the encryption. So what do you have to say about that?
You probably should buy a new phone. It's probably vulnerable to stage fright. No, I'm not kidding.
That's a great answer as well. However, that's a legitimate concern, right? Because there's large consumer applications, or in ftc.gov, places where people who have a variety of devices still need to access the site. But comes a time when the technology continues to move forward, and there's a decision made at the executive level saying we have to keep moving to be secure for most people most of the time, and there's people that might not come along with us, but at the end of the day, we have to move forward. So it results in decisions like that and situations like that.
But it's essentially a government website, and all the information that is available there is public. So why do you restrict access to it effectively?
It's a judgment of risk for most people most of the time who will be more secure. And there will be a small, hopefully minimal group who will not be able to access the resource. But the decision is that for majority of the public, it's the right decision.
So to answer that question legitimately, one thing we found at eBay, one of the very few things I learned at eBay that was very useful is how weird the internet is. For instance, we were forced to support web TV. And web TV can't even handle the simplest type of cookies. So when you're eBay and you're setting, I don't know, like hundreds and hundreds of them, it becomes a problem. So we had to do some crazy browser sniffing to allow even the simplest features to exist, like web TV being able to log in. And the reason we had to support web TV is because the next door neighbor of one of our board members used web TV to log into eBay. And he complained, and we had to deal with that. I'm not kidding. That's actually how it happened. So having an alternate path is an option. It just doesn't increase the security very much for that user. I mean, they're taking a huge risk in having that functionality exist. It's actually better to get them off that technology.
All right, well, I think we're out of time, but I wanted to thank Robert, Claire, and Caleb very much for sharing their expertise and thoughts with us this afternoon. Thank you.
And I want to thank you all, in conclusion, for coming to the FTC's Start with Security event. Thanks to the audience for attending, and thanks for all the great panelists for sharing your expertise. And a special thanks to the University of Texas, the Strauss Center and Center for Identity, for offering us this beautiful facility, and your wonderful staff who's been tremendously helpful in making this a successful event. Also, thank you to the Capital Factory and many others here who helped us promote the event. In conclusion, while this is the end of today's event, it's not the end of Start with Security. I would ask you, when you do leave, to complete your return your evaluation card so that we can make future Start with Security events even more successful. I also wanted to remind you that you can order all of our materials in bulk for free at bulkorder.ftc.gov, and most of them are available in Spanish as well. Check out our next Start with Security event, which will be in Seattle on February 9th. And you can also stay tuned for more videos and guidance as part of the Start with Security series. You saw 2 new videos today. Eventually, we will have 10 videos in this series. And the best way really to find out about what's going on at the FTC for the business community is to subscribe to the FTC's business blog, which is listed right here at business.ftc.gov/blog. So we hope you all will sign up for that to learn about future Start with Security events, new FTC cases, new business guidance, and more. You can also check out ftc.gov/data security for more information on a whole variety of data security topics. So thanks again for coming. Please do hand in your evaluation cards on the way out and take back what you learned today and start with security in your own company. Thank you.